She lied about her name. She lied about her age. She lied about everything in that letter she sent to Montana. But there was one line she wrote that was absolutely true. I am willing to do whatever it takes. Clementine Brooks stepped off that train with $14, a carpetbag, and a warrant chasing her from Chicago. She was supposed to meet the man who sent for her. But here's the thing. He never sent for her. He didn't even know she was coming. And when she knocked on that cabin door, it wasn't a husband who answered. It was an 8-year-old girl who hadn't spoken a single word in 14 months. And the first thing that child whispered was, "Mama, you finally came." What Clementine found on that mountain was not what she expected. A grieving father hiding from the truth, 3 children slowly going wild, and a dead woman's secret buried beneath the floorboards, a secret that would change everything. This story will remind you of something we all forget. The family you're born into is luck, but the family you choose is courage. The meaning. This is a story about 2 broken people who stopped running from their guilt and started running toward the truth. It's about forgiveness, not the easy kind, but the kind that costs you everything and rebuilds you from the ground up. If this story stirred something in you, drop a comment and tell me. Would you have gotten in that wagon? And if you don't want to miss the next tale from the frontier, hit subscribe and stay close. The best stories are the ones that find you when you need them most. Clementine Brooks had lied on every line of the letter she sent to Montana. Her name, her age, her reasons for coming. But the one thing she wrote true was this: I am willing to do whatever it takes. She sat in the last car of the Northern Pacific, watching the world change through a window smeared with coal dust and fingerprints. Illinois had been flat and gray. The Dakota Territory was flatter and grayer. But somewhere west of Billings, the earth began to rise like the spine of some great sleeping animal, and Clementine pressed her forehead against the cold glass and felt something she had not felt in months. Not hope, exactly. More like the absence of the thing that had been crushing her chest since Chicago. The rail car smelled of tobacco spit and wet wool, and the sour breath of too many people packed too close together. A child 2 rows up had been crying since Miles City. His mother looked like she had stopped hearing it a long time ago. Clementine understood that. There were sounds you stopped hearing when the world got loud enough. The sound of your own conscience, for instance. She reached into the pocket of her traveling coat and pulled out a folded document. The paper was heavy, official. Across the top in bold black ink it read, Cook County Circuit Court. Beneath that, her real name. The name she would never use again if God or luck or the devil gave her half a chance. She stood, walked to the pot-bellied stove at the end of the car, and fed the paper into the fire. She watched the words curl and blacken. Cook County. Clara Brennan. Wanted. The flames ate them all the same. A man across the aisle watched her do it. He had the look of a drummer, a traveling salesman with soft hands and a sample case between his knees. He raised an eyebrow. Cold morning, she said to him, as if she had been warming her hands. He shrugged and went back to his newspaper. Clementine returned to her seat. Her hands were shaking, but her face was still. She had learned that trick from Edmund Voss. Keep the face still and the hands hidden, and nobody knows what you are carrying. Of course, Voss had taught her other things, too. How to forge a signature so clean even the signer could not tell the difference. How to file a land deed with the county recorder and walk out with a smile. How to look a man in the eye while you stole his farm from under him. She had not been tricked into it. That was the part that sat heaviest. Voss had not forced her or fooled her. He had offered her money, and she had taken it, because her father was coughing blood into a basin, and the doctor would not come back without payment. She signed those deeds, knowing they were false. 37 families, 37 farms. She could not remember all their names, but she remembered their faces at the courthouse when the scheme unraveled. The confusion, the fear, and Voss standing in the gallery pointing at her, saying she had acted alone. That was 6 months ago. She had been running since. The train began to slow. The conductor walked through calling Elk Fork in a voice like a rusted hinge. Elk Fork Station. End of the line. Clementine gathered her single carpet bag, the one she had packed in the dark of a Chicago boarding house with her landlady pounding on the door for rent she could not pay. She had 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a Bible she did not read, and $14. She had spent the rest on the train ticket and the mail-order bride fee at the matrimonial agency. She stepped onto the platform, and the wind hit her like a wall. It came funneling down through the foothills of what she would later learn were the Absaroka Mountains, and it carried with it the smell of sagebrush and pine, and something vast and mineral, like the smell of stone that has been cold for 1,000 years. The sky was so wide and so pale it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of the world with nothing between her and God. In Chicago, there were buildings and alleys and doorways to duck into, corners to hide behind, shadows that swallowed you whole if you knew where to stand. Here there was nothing. The platform was a plank of wood. Beyond it was a dirt road, and beyond that was a town that looked like it had been dropped from a great height and nobody had bothered to pick up the pieces. A general store, a saloon with no name on it, a blacksmith shop with the doors open, a church with a crooked steeple. Clementine pulled her shawl tighter and scanned the platform for a man matching the description in the letter. Tall, dark-haired, broad. The description had been written by someone else she now knew. But at the time she had pictured a man who looked like he belonged on this land the way a tree belongs to the ground it grows from. There was no tall, dark-haired man. There was a short, stocky fellow with a tobacco-stained beard and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. He stood beside a buckboard wagon with 2 mules that looked as tired as he did. He was holding a hand-lettered sign that read, Brooks. Clementine walked toward him. She kept her posture straight, the way her father had taught her. Chin up, shoulders back. Act like you belong, and people will believe you do. Miss Brooks, the man said. He did not offer his hand. His eyes were jumpy, skipping from her face to the train to the road and back again. I am Jed Hawkins. I was sent to collect you. Sent by Mr. Halloway, Clementine said. Jed chewed on something, his jaw working sideways like a mule on a cud. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other. Well now, about that. He loaded her carpet bag into the wagon with a kind of nervous energy that made Clementine's instincts sharpen. She had spent 5 years reading People for Voss. Nervous meant guilty. Guilty meant secret. She did not ask him what was wrong. She catalogued it and climbed onto the bench beside him. The wagon ride took the better part of 2 hours. The trail wound up from the valley floor into the foothills, switching back on itself like a snake trying to shake something off its tail. The mules leaned into the grade and the wheels creaked, and Jed said almost nothing. Once they passed a meadow where an elk herd was grazing. There must have been 200 of them, maybe more, spread across the golden grass like something out of a painting Clementine had seen once in the Art Institute. The bulls had racks of antlers so wide they looked like they would topple under the weight. When the wagon passed, the nearest bull raised his head and bugled. The sound was high and eerie, like a woman screaming very far away. Clementine had never heard anything like it. They are beautiful, she said, mostly to fill the silence. Jed grunted. They will gore you if you get close. More silence. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed. Clementine could see her breath now. The aspens along the trail had already turned, their leaves shaking in the wind like coins made of gold. Below them, the valley spread out in a patchwork of brown and amber, bisected by a creek that caught the late afternoon light and turned it into a ribbon of silver. He is a good man, Miss Brooks, Jed said suddenly, as if the words had been stuck in his throat for the whole ride. He just forgot how. Clementine did not know what to do with that. The trail leveled out into a clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines so tall and straight they looked like the bars of a cage. In the center of the clearing sat a cabin. It was built of logs, hand-hewn from the look of them, with a stone chimney and a roof that sagged on one side like a tired horse. A barn stood to the left, its doors hanging crooked on leather hinges. A corral held 2 horses and a mule. The yard was a mess of wood chips, rusted tools, and weeds that had given up pretending to be a garden. It was the loneliest-looking place Clementine had ever seen, and she had seen the inside of a Cook County jail cell. Jed pulled the wagon to a stop. He would not look at her. His hands gripped the reins so tight his knuckles had gone white. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I need to tell you something before we go in there." "All right. Arthur did not send for you." Clementine felt the cold settle deeper into her bones. "What do you mean?" "I mean he does not know you are coming. He did not place the advertisement. He did not write the letter." Jed swallowed hard. "I did." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Clementine could hear the wind in the pines and the soft chuffing of the mules and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the ridge. She could hear her own heartbeat. "Why?" she said. "Because he is dying up here," Jed said. "Not from sickness, from giving up. Those children are half wild. He has not come to town in 4 months. I thought if someone came, if a woman came, somebody strong, maybe it would remind him that there is still something worth keeping alive for." He looked at her then, and there was guilt in his eyes, but also something else, something she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror. Desperation. The look of a man who had done something wrong because every right option had already been tried. Clementine sat very still. She thought about the $14 in her pocket. She thought about the telegram that was probably already making its way west from Chicago. She thought about the fact that she had no place in the world to go back to. "Well," she said, "we'd better go inside then." She climbed down from the wagon, smoothed her skirt, and walked toward the cabin door. She knocked twice. The wood was solid under her knuckles. The door opened. Clementine had prepared herself for an angry man. She had steeled herself for shouting, for the barrel of a rifle, for a door slammed in her face. She had not prepared for the girl. She was maybe 8 years old, thin as a rail, with hair that had not seen a brush in weeks, and eyes that were too large for her face. She stood in the doorway like a ghost that had forgotten it was dead. She looked at Clementine for a long time. Then she spoke, and her voice was rough and strange, like a hinge that had rusted shut and was being forced open for the first time. "Mama," the girl whispered, "you finally came." Arthur Halloway heard his daughter speak for the first time in 14 months, and the first thing she said was a lie. He did not know which miracle to mourn. He had been in the back room sharpening a trap spring when the knock came. He heard the door open. He heard Lottie's voice, that small, scratched sound that he had given up praying for. And for one wild instant his heart seized because the voice sounded so much like Mary's that his dead wife might as well have walked back through the door. Then he came around the corner and saw the woman. She was not Mary. Mary had been soft and round and fair-haired, built like a woman who had grown up in a house with a parlor and a piano. This woman was tall and dark-haired and thin in a way that suggested she had missed meals not by choice. Her dress was clean but faded to the color of dishwater. Her boots were city boots, already cracking from the cold. She had a jaw that looked like it had been set against something and not yet released. Lottie stood in front of her, one small hand reaching out but not quite touching the woman's skirt, as if she was afraid the vision would dissolve. Arthur looked past the woman to the wagon in the yard, to Jed sitting on the bench like a man waiting to be shot. "Jed," Arthur said. His voice came out low and flat, the way the ground sounds before a tremor. "What did you do?" The next 5 minutes were the worst Clementine had experienced since the night she fled Chicago, and she had fled that city with a sheriff's deputy 2 blocks behind her. Arthur came through the cabin like a storm front. He grabbed Jed by the shirt front and hauled him clean off the ground, pressing him against the porch post with one arm. Jed's boots dangled 6 inches off the boards. Arthur was everything the letter had described, and nothing the letter had prepared her for. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that blocked the doorway like a wall. His beard was dark and unkempt, his hair too long. his clothes stiff with the kind of grime that comes from a man who has stopped caring whether he's clean. But his eyes were the thing. They were gray, the color of gunmetal, and they burned with a fury so hot Clementine could almost feel the heat from where she stood. "You had no right," Arthur said to Jed, and each word sounded like a nail being driven. Jed did not fight back. He hung there like a rag doll and said, "I know." Clementine did not scream or faint or clutch her hands together. She had learned in Voss's office that the fastest way to stop a violent man was not to match his violence, but to redirect it. You had to give him something else to think about, something more immediate than his rage. "You can beat your friend after," she said. Her voice was steady, but her knees were not, and she was grateful for the long skirt that hid them. "First, tell me when these children last ate a full meal." Arthur turned to look at her. For a moment she thought he might drop Jed and come for her instead. But something in the question, or maybe in the way she asked it like a woman who expected an answer and was prepared to wait all night for it, made him pause. He set Jed down. Jed coughed and rubbed his throat. Arthur looked at his children. Tate was standing at the top of the loft ladder, watching the scene with the cool assessment of a boy who had learned early that adults could not be trusted. He was 12 and tall for his age, with his father's sharp jaw and his mother's watchful eyes. He held a skinning knife the way a man holds a tool he is comfortable with. Lottie had retreated to the corner of the room. The word mama had slipped out of her like a bird escaping a cage, and now she was ashamed. She pressed her back against the log wall and stared at a spot on the floor and said nothing more. Jeb was 4 years old and had no memory of his mother. He stood in the middle of the room with his thumb in his mouth and his other hand reaching toward Clementine's skirt. He had been reaching for women since he could walk, and every housekeeper and churchwoman who had come through this cabin had eventually left. But he kept reaching, because that is what 4-year-old children do. They reach for warmth, even when it burns them. Arthur watched his youngest son take hold of a stranger's dress and felt something twist in his chest that he did not have a name for. It was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the realization that his boy had given up on him and was looking for comfort in the first woman who walked through the door. "She cannot stay," Arthur said. His voice had gone from hot to cold, which was more dangerous. "She goes back on the morning wagon." Clementine looked around the cabin. It was worse than the yard. Dirty tin plates stacked on a table that had not been wiped in weeks. Clothes piled in corners. The fire was down to coals. The air smelled of old grease and unwashed bodies, and something else, something sweet and rotten, that she traced to a haunch of venison hanging near the door that had turned. But it was what she did not see that struck her hardest. There were hooks on the walls, small iron hooks at regular intervals, the kind used to hang looking glasses. Every one of them was empty. There was not a single mirror in the house. She filed that away. She filed everything away. It was what she did. "One night," she said. "I have nowhere to go tonight. Give me one night and I will be gone in the morning." Arthur stared at her for a long count. Then he looked at Jeb, who was now leaning his head against her hip with his eyes half closed. "One night," Arthur said. He walked to the rifle cabinet, locked it with a key he put around his neck, and dragged a blanket to the foot of the loft ladder. He sat down with his back against the rungs, and his arms crossed over his chest. He did not sleep. He watched her. And Clementine, who had spent 5 years learning to read people the way a card sharp reads a table, watched him back. She noticed that his hands, for all their size, were gentle when he lifted Jeb off her skirt and carried the boy to bed. She noticed that he paused at the top of the ladder and pressed his lips to Lottie's forehead, even though the girl was pretending to be asleep. She noticed that he said nothing to Tate, and that Tate said nothing to him, and that the silence between father and eldest son was the loudest thing in the cabin. She also noticed, and this she catalogued most carefully of all, that he checked the back door twice before settling down, that his eyes went to the window facing the tree line every few minutes, that he held the Winchester across his knees even though the rifle cabinet was locked. Arthur Halloway was not just grieving, he was guarding. And Clementine, who knew something about being hunted, recognized the posture of a man who expected something to come out of the dark. She lay on the narrow cot in the room off the kitchen. It had been Mary's sewing room once, she guessed, from the basket of thread still sitting on the shelf. The mattress was straw and lumpy and smelled of mouse. She pulled Arthur's spare blanket up to her chin and listened to the house settle around her. Past midnight, she heard Arthur rise from the loft ladder. She heard the back door open and close. She heard his boots on the porch boards, heavy and deliberate. And then nothing. Just the wind. She went to the window and looked out through a crack in the shutter. Arthur stood on the back porch with the Winchester raised, scanning the tree line. The moon was 3/4 full, and the clearing was washed in a light so pale it made the snow look blue. He stood like that for a long time. Then he lowered the rifle and looked down. He crouched. When he stood again, his face had changed. The anger was gone. In its place was something older and more tired, something that looked like fear. Clementine could not see what he had seen. But in the morning, when she slipped out to the porch while Arthur was feeding the horses, she found what had changed his face. Boot prints. A man's boots, pressed into the hoarfrost that coated the porch boards like a skin of white glass. The prints came from the direction of the tree line, and they stopped at the porch rail, right at the spot where someone could stand and look through the kitchen window. Then they turned and went toward the creek. Clementine stood over those prints and felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Someone had been standing here in the dark, watching. She looked at the creek, glinting silver in the early light, and she thought of Mary Halloway, the wife who died of fever, the wife nobody talked about. The wife whose room was locked from the inside and whose mirrors had been torn from the walls. She was supposed to leave on the morning wagon. She had $14 and a carpet bag and every reason in the world to put this mountain behind her. But the boot prints went toward the creek, and Clementine Brooks, who had spent her whole life running from things, felt for the first time the strange and terrible pull of running toward one instead. She went inside and started making breakfast. Clementine knew how to make a place look like a home. She also knew how to recognize when a home was trying to hide something. By the second morning, she had abandoned any pretense of leaving. Not because she had decided to stay, but because the morning wagon did not come. The first snow of the season had fallen overnight, 2 inches of it, and Jed sent word through a trapper passing on the ridge that the switchback trail was iced over, and no wagon would attempt it until the temperature rose. Arthur received this news with a grunt that could have meant anything. He shrugged into his buffalo coat and went to check his trap lines without looking at her. Clementine stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the wreckage of a life. The filth was not laziness. She had known lazy men, and lazy men let things pile up in a careless, accidental way. This was different. This cabin had been deliberately abandoned while people still lived in it. The curtains had been taken down and not put back. The rag rug had been rolled up and shoved under the cot. The mantel above the fireplace had been swept clean of every photograph, every keepsake, every small thing that makes a shelf look like it belongs to someone. Arthur Halloway had not let his home fall apart. He had stripped it on purpose. He had removed everything that looked like Mary. Clementine began to clean, not because she was the kind of woman who cleaned, but because she could not think in chaos. In Chicago, when the marshals were closing in and Voss was in a holding cell spinning lies about her, the only thing Clementine could control was the floor of her room. She swept it 3 times a day. She scrubbed the boards until they were pale as bone. It did not help, but it kept her hands busy while her mind worked. Now her hands worked, and her mind turned over the same questions. The boot prints, the locked room, the empty hooks where mirrors used to hang, and the girl who had called her Mama. Tate watched her from the loft with the flat eyes of a barn cat watching a stranger cross the yard. He did not threaten her. He did not brandish the skinning knife or put a snake in her bed, or any of the things the previous housekeepers had reported. He did something worse. He sat on the edge of the loft with his legs dangling over and said to Jeb in a voice pitched perfectly for Clementine to hear, "Do not get used to her. She will leave." They all leave. Clementine's hands stopped moving on the scrub brush. The words hit her in a place she had not expected, because they were true. She was planning to leave. As soon as the snow melted, as soon as the pass opened, she would take the first wagon down and catch the next train east or west or anywhere that was not here. She was using this family as a hiding place. The warmth they gave her, Jeb's small hand reaching for her skirt, Lottie's ghost voice saying, "Mama," Arthur's grudging silence that was almost like permission, she was using all of it. And she would leave it behind the way Voss had left her behind, the way everyone left everyone. The guilt was immediate and sharp, like stepping on a nail in a dark room. She went back to scrubbing. By midday, she had cleared the worst of it. The dishes were washed and stacked. The rotten venison was buried in the yard. The floor was swept and scrubbed, and the fire was built up properly, with a banked log that would hold heat instead of the smoldering mess Arthur had been tending. She was on her knees near the kitchen stove, working at a stain that had soaked into the grain of the wood, when the floor gave under her brush. A board shifted. She pried it up with her fingernails and found a hollow beneath, no bigger than a bread box. Inside was a tin box. The tin was old and dented, the kind used for storing tea or biscuits. She opened it. Inside were three things: an empty brown glass bottle with no label, the kind used by apothecaries. She uncorked it and sniffed. Nothing. Whatever had been in it was long gone. A pressed flower, dried flat between two squares of blotting paper. The petals were dark purple, almost blue. The shape was unusual, like a monk's hood, with a tall arching top and two wing-like sides. She did not recognize it. And a letter, folded once, sealed with a drop of candle wax that had been broken and resealed. The handwriting on the front was feminine and careful. It read, "For my father. Never sent." Clementine held the letter and felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was nothing. The other kind. The kind that comes when you hold in your hands a dead woman's last words, and you know that whatever is written inside will change something that cannot be changed back. Her instinct, trained by 5 years of handling legal documents for Voss, told her to preserve this. Do not read it in haste. Do not crumple it. Do not let emotion make you careless with evidence. Because that is what this was. Evidence. Of what she did not yet know. She replaced the floorboard, carried the tin box to her room, and hid it beneath the straw mattress. Then she went back to cleaning as if nothing had happened. That afternoon she found a sack of flour in the pantry that was still good, along with salt pork, dried beans, a cone of brown sugar, and some baking soda. She made biscuits, real biscuits, the kind her father used to make on Sunday mornings in their kitchen above the print shop, with the dough worked just enough and not a stroke more, so they came out tall and flaky and steaming. Jeb ate 4 of them. He sat on the bench with his feet swinging and crumbs on his chin, and a look of pure astonishment on his face, as if he had forgotten that food could taste like something other than survival. Lottie ate too, slowly, with her eyes down. She did not speak. But when Clementine set the plate in front of her, Lottie's hand moved across the table and touched Clementine's wrist. Just the tips of her fingers, just for a second. Then she pulled away. Tate ate nothing. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set. "I'm not hungry," he said, even though Clementine could hear his stomach from across the room. She left 2 biscuits on a cloth near the loft ladder and said nothing about them. In the morning, they were gone. When Arthur came back at dusk, he stopped in the doorway. The cabin looked different, not transformed, not pretty, but different in a way that went deeper than clean floors and washed dishes. It looked like someone had decided it was worth caring about. He stood in the doorway and did not speak. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Clementine watched him from the corner of her eye as she stirred a pot of beans on the stove. She saw his hand come up and press against the doorframe, his fingers digging into the wood so hard she could see the tendons in his wrist. He was holding something back, something so large it took his whole body to contain it. Then he stepped inside and sat at the table and ate the food she put in front of him without a word. He did not thank her. He did not look at her. But he ate every bite, and when he was done, he sat with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and stared into the fire, and his face was the face of a man who has been drowning and has just felt his feet touch bottom. After the children were in the loft, Jeb asked Clementine for a story. She sat on the edge of his pallet, and because she did not know any children's stories, she made one up. Once there was a fox, she said. He got lost in a storm and could not find his den. The snow was deep and the wind was bad, and he was scared because foxes are not supposed to be scared, but he was. He found a cave in the rocks, and inside the cave there were wolves. The wolves said, "This is not your den," and the fox said, "I know. But if you let me stay until the storm passes, I will not take up much room." "What happened?" Jeb whispered. His eyes were already closing. "The wolves let him stay," Clementine said. And when the storm passed, the fox discovered that the cave had become his den after all. And the wolves, well, they were not wolves anymore, they were family. Jeb smiled and closed his eyes. From across the loft in the dark, Clementine heard the soft sound of Lottie breathing. The girl was not asleep. She was listening. Later that night, when the cabin was still and the fire was banked and the only sound was the wind testing the chinking between the logs, Clementine lit a candle and opened Mary's letter. The handwriting was steady. Not the scrawl of a mad woman, not the shaking hand of someone gripped by fever or fear. It was the careful, measured script of a woman who wanted to be believed and knew she might not be. "Dear Father," the letter began. "I am writing this because I no longer trust my own voice to tell you what I need to say, and because the last time I tried to speak to you, you closed the door." Clementine read on. The letter described Mary's illness, the weakness and the stomach pains that had begun in late summer and worsened through the fall. It described her suspicion about the creek water, how she had stopped drinking from it and felt better, then started again and felt worse. It described her visit to Agatha Clearwater, the Crow midwife, and how Agatha had found something wrong with the water. "Poison," Mary wrote, "not from a bottle, from the ground." But it was the final passage that made Clementine set the letter down and press her hand over her mouth. "Someone goes to the creek before dawn," Mary had written. "I never see a face, only a shape. But they know the back trail, the one that cuts behind the barn and drops down to the water through the juniper thicket. Only family knows that trail, Father. Only someone who has lived in this house." Clementine stared at those words. The back trail, the one only family would know. That meant Arthur, who had built this homestead with his own hands. It meant Tate, who ran these woods like a wild thing. And it meant someone else. Someone who had once lived here or known it well enough to move through it in the dark. She folded the letter and put it back in the tin box. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe around her. Somewhere above, Arthur paced the main room the way he did every night. Below her, through the floorboards, she could hear the creak. It sounded like whispered conversation, like secrets being passed along. She had come to Montana to disappear. But this house had secrets of its own, and they were rising up through the floor like water through a crack in the foundation. Clementine closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. Arthur knew Clementine had found something. He could see it in the way she held the paring knife when she peeled potatoes, the blade always angled toward him. It had been 4 days since she arrived. The snow had not melted and the pass was still closed, and she had not left, and Arthur had stopped telling her to. He could not have explained why if someone had put a rifle to his head. Maybe it was the biscuits. Maybe it was the way Jeb laughed now, a sound Arthur had not heard in so long. It startled him like a gunshot the first time. Maybe it was the sight of Lottie sitting closer to the fire in the evenings, instead of pressing herself into the darkest corner of the loft. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in 2 years, When Arthur came home at the end of the day, the cabin did not smell like death. But something had changed in Clementine. Something had shifted behind her eyes. She was still polite, still competent, still the kind of woman who could stretch a sack of flour into a week's worth of meals and make it look easy. But she had started watching him the way you watch a horse you are not sure is broken. She watched his hands when he drank his coffee. She watched the axe when he split wood. She positioned herself near the door when he was in the room, always within a step of the exit. She flinched, just barely, when he reached past her for the salt. Arthur recognized this. He had seen it in soldiers who had been ambushed, in horses that had been beaten, in his own wife during those last terrible months when she had stopped trusting everything and everyone, including him. He thought about saying something. He thought about asking her what she had found under the floorboard, because he had seen the fresh scrub marks near the stove and the way the board sat not quite flush anymore. He had survived the Nez Perce campaign by noticing things other men missed: a bent blade of grass, a print in the mud, a board that did not sit right. But he said nothing, because in the deep and rotten heart of his guilt, Arthur thought maybe she was right to be afraid of him. Maybe he deserved to be watched the way you watch a dangerous animal. He had failed Mary. He had heard her beg for help, and he had turned away because he was afraid that if he looked too closely at what was happening to her, he would see his own mother staring back at him. His mother, Ruth Halloway, had lost her mind when Arthur was 9 years old. It had happened slowly and then all at once, the way a riverbank erodes. First, she started talking to people who were not there. Then she stopped sleeping. Then she stopped eating. Then she walked into the Yellowstone River in January and did not walk back out. Arthur had never told anyone about his mother. Not Mary, not Jed, not the army doctors who asked him about family history when he enlisted. He carried it like a stone in his chest. This knowledge that the blood in his veins came from a woman whose mind had broken, and that any woman he loved might break the same way, and that he might not be able to tell the difference between madness and truth until it was too late. When Mary started seeing figures in the tree line and hearing things in the walls and claiming the water was poison, Arthur had looked at her and seen Ruth. He had pulled away not out of cruelty, but out of terror. If Mary was going mad, he did not know how to save her. He did not even know how to stand close to it. So he slept in the barn and told her she was imagining things and counted the days until winter would pass and he could take her to Helena for a doctor. Winter did not pass in time. Mary died on a Tuesday in February. She died alone in the bed they had shared for 8 years, while Arthur was in the barn, because he could not face the sound of her voice calling his name in the dark. The town said it was fever. Arthur knew better. Arthur knew that whatever had killed Mary, he had helped it along by leaving her alone with it. So when Clementine watched him with fear in her eyes, Arthur accepted it. He even felt a grim satisfaction. At least she has the sense to be afraid, he thought. More sense than Mary had. There was a room in the cabin that was locked. It was Mary's room, the bedroom they had shared. After she died, Arthur had moved his blankets to the main room and locked the door and put the key in his pocket. He had not opened it since. He did not know what was in there anymore. He did not want to know. He was afraid that if he opened it, he would find something that proved he should have listened to her. And then the last wall he had built between himself and his guilt would come down, and there would be nothing left of him at all. Maybe it is better this way, he thought, watching Clementine edge toward the door as he sat down to supper. If she is afraid, she will leave, and if she leaves, I will not have to explain why that door is still locked. On the 5th morning, Clementine was gone. Not gone from the homestead, but gone from the cabin. Arthur found her cot empty, her boots missing, and tracks in the snow leading toward the creek. He stood on the porch and told himself it was not his concern. She was a grown woman. If she wanted to go tramping through the woods in November in city boots with no rifle and no idea what lived in these mountains, that was her business. He told himself this for about 15 minutes. Then he grabbed the Winchester and followed her tracks. The trail led up the creek. Clementine had followed the water upstream, stepping where the rocks were clear, slipping where the bank was muddy. He could read her passage as easily as he read a newspaper. She had stopped here, knelt there, examined something on the ground near the big boulder where the creek narrowed. She had left the creek bed and climbed the ridge toward the headwaters. Arthur followed. He moved quietly out of habit the way the army had trained him. The forest up here was old-growth Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, the trunks so thick 2 men could not have joined hands around them. The ground was covered in a carpet of brown needles that muffled every step. The air smelled of resin and cold stone and something mineral, something sharp, like the smell of a blacksmith's forge. He found the mule deer carcass first. It had been there for months, maybe a year. The bones were scattered and the hide was mostly gone. But the placement was wrong. The deer had died near the headwaters of the creek, where the water came up through a fissure in the volcanic rock. Animals did not usually die near water unless the water was bad. Arthur crouched and looked at the rock face. He had been here before, many times. He knew these rocks. He knew the greenish-white deposits that stained the stone near the seep, the mineral formation the old-timers called Kill Rock because livestock that drank too close to it sometimes sickened. He had always kept his cattle away from this stretch. Mary had known to collect water from below the main spring where the creek had diluted the mineral enough to be safe. But now, looking more closely, he saw something he had never seen before. Chisel marks. Someone had taken a tool to the rock face and widened the natural crack where the arsenic-bearing water seeped through. The marks were old, overgrown with lichen, but they were there. Deliberate. Purposeful. Someone had poisoned the creek on purpose. Not with a bottle of arsenic dropped in the water, which would have been temporary, but by widening the natural source which would make the contamination permanent and untraceable. It would look like nature. It would look like bad luck. Arthur stood up slowly. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold. Mary had told him the water was wrong. Mary had begged him to listen, and he had said it was her nerves. He had said she was becoming like his mother. He stood there in the silence of the old-growth forest and felt the full weight of what he had done, or rather, what he had failed to do. It pressed down on him like a rock on his chest, and he could not breathe under it. He wanted to hit something. He wanted to scream. He wanted to go back in time to that February night and open the bedroom door and sit beside his wife and say, "I believe you. I am sorry. Tell me everything, but you cannot go back. That is the cruelest thing about time. It only moves one direction." A sound brought him back. A crashing in the brush above him. Heavy. Fast. He raised the Winchester. Then he heard Clementine scream. He ran. Up the ridge, through the fir trees, his boots slipping on the needles. He came out into a small clearing near the headwaters and saw the bear. A black bear, a sow by the size of her, maybe 300 pounds. She was standing on her hind legs near the old deer carcass, huffing, her jaws popping. Clementine was 15 feet up a Douglas fir. She had climbed it badly. Her skirt was torn, her hands were bleeding, and she was clinging to a branch with her eyes squeezed shut, and her face the color of candle wax. Arthur did not hesitate. He fired twice into the air. The shots cracked through the valley like thunder, and the sow dropped to all fours, swung her head toward him, and then turned and crashed into the brush. He could hear her moving away up the ridge, breaking branches as she went. He stood beneath the tree and looked up. "You planning on coming down," he said, "or you setting up house for the winter?" Despite everything, despite the fear and the blood on her palms and the fact that she was stuck in a tree in the Montana wilderness in November, Clementine almost laughed. The sound caught in her throat and came out as something between a cough and a sob. "I cannot let go," she said. Her fingers were locked around the branch. The cold had stiffened them into claws. Arthur leaned the Winchester against the trunk and climbed. The tree was old and the bark was rough, and the lower branches were thick enough to hold his weight. He got within arm's reach of her and braced himself against the trunk. "Give me your hand," he said. "I cannot." "Yes, you can." He did not say it gently. He said it the way a sergeant says it, like an order that expects to be obeyed. She released one hand. He took it. Her fingers were ice cold and sticky with sap and blood. He pried the other hand loose from the branch, and she fell, not gracefully, not the way it happens in stories. She fell like a sack of flour, and he caught her badly, and they both went down, tumbling off the lower branches and into the snow in a tangle of limbs and coat and bark. She was on her back. He was half on top of her, one arm around her waist, the other braced in the snow. Her elbow was in his ribs. His beard was in her hair. They were both breathing hard, and neither of them moved. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He could feel her heartbeat through the wool of her coat. Or maybe it was his own. He could not tell where one ended and the other began. Then he rolled off her and stood and brushed the snow from his coat and offered her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her up. She winced when she put weight on her right foot. She had scraped her palms raw on the bark, and there was a scratch on her cheek that was beading blood. "Can you walk?" he said. "I can walk." They went back down the ridge in silence. The afternoon light was slanting through the firs in long gold bars, and the creek was loud with snowmelt, and neither of them spoke. Clementine limped, but she did not ask for help, and Arthur did not offer it, though he shortened his stride so she could keep pace. At the edge of the clearing, Arthur stopped. Clementine stopped behind him. She saw what he was looking at. There was a mound of earth beneath a lodgepole pine. No marker, no cross, no stone, just bare dirt and a slight rise, the grass around it taller than the grass elsewhere because the soil had been turned. Arthur knelt beside it. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. His lips moved. She could not hear the words. She watched him from 10 feet away and tried to read the shape of his mouth. She caught one phrase, just one, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. "I know you were not crazy," he said to the mound of earth. "I figured it out too late." He stood, put his hat back on, and walked to the cabin. He did not look at her. He did not explain. Clementine stood alone in the clearing with the wind pulling at her hair and the shadow of the mountain creeping across the yard. He was talking to Mary. He was telling his dead wife that he believed her. And Clementine could not tell if this was the confession of a grieving husband or a guilty one. That night she lay in her cot and thought about the chisel marks on the rock. She had seen them before Arthur found her. She had knelt by that fissure and run her fingers over the gouges, and known with the certainty that comes from years of examining forged documents that these marks were made by human hands with human intent. Someone had poisoned the creek, someone who knew the land, someone who knew that the natural arsenic in the volcanic rock could be amplified, turned from a nuisance into a weapon. She thought about the back trail Mary had described. The one only family would know. She thought about Arthur kneeling at Mary's grave. "I know you were not crazy." Did he know because he was the one who had done it? Or did he know because he had finally looked at the evidence his wife had begged him to see? Clementine did not know. And not knowing was the most dangerous thing of all. The sound of hooves on the switchback trail always arrived 15 minutes before the rider. That morning, standing on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, Clementine counted 4 horses. It had been a week since she arrived at the Halloway homestead. The snow had melted enough to clear the lower switchbacks, but not the upper pass, which meant she could receive visitors but could not easily leave. She did not know if this was a comfort or a trap. She set down the coffee and went inside. "Arthur," she said, "riders coming. 4 of them." Arthur was at the table mending a leather harness with an awl and waxed thread. He did not look up. He did not need to. He had heard the hooves before she did. "Pruitt," he said. The way he said the name told her everything she needed to know. It was the way a man says the name of a wound that will not heal. They came into the yard at a walk. The lead rider was on a tall bay horse, a good horse, better than anything in Arthur's corral. The man who rode it was in his 60s with silver hair under a black felt hat and a face that had been handsome once and was now hard in the way that dried leather is hard. He wore a dark wool coat with a fur collar, and his boots were polished to a shine that had no business being on a mountain trail. Behind him rode three men. One of them wore a star. Clementine recognized the type immediately. She had seen men like this in Chicago courtrooms. Men who owned things, not just property, but people, outcomes, the direction of conversations. Men who entered a room and rearranged it around themselves without appearing to move. Arthur stepped onto the porch. He had not reached for the Winchester. His hands hung at his sides, but his fingers were curled, and the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. "Judge," Arthur said. "Arthur," the older man said. He dismounted with the ease of a man who had spent his life on horseback. His eyes moved past Arthur and found Clementine in the doorway. They lingered. Then they moved to the window where Tate's face was visible, and then to the yard, where Jeb was playing with a stick horse near the corral. "I came to see my grandchildren," Pruitt said. His voice was like poured honey, smooth and slow and impossible to argue with. "I trust that is not a problem." It was not a question. Arthur said nothing. He stepped aside. Pruitt climbed the porch steps and entered the cabin as if he owned it. The sheriff, a big man with a weathered face and a drooping mustache, stayed outside. He leaned against the porch rail and looked at Arthur with an expression Clementine had seen before. Not hatred. Pity. It was the look of a man who knew something terrible and could not say it. Clementine filed that away. Inside, Pruitt moved through the cabin with the authority of a man conducting an inspection. He noted the clean floor, the mended curtain, the fire crackling properly on the hearth. His eyes missed nothing. They settled on Clementine. "I do not believe we have met," he said. "Clementine Brooks," she said. She kept her voice level. "I am helping with the household." Pruitt's eyebrow rose. A fraction of an inch. "Brooks. That is an Eastern name. Where are you from, Miss Brooks?" "Chicago," Clementine said, and she felt the words stick in her throat like a fishbone. Chicago. Pruitt turned the word over like a man examining a coin for counterfeits. "Long way to come for housekeeping work. You have references, I assume. Papers?" The question hit her like a slap. She did not flinch. She had trained herself not to flinch. But inside, in the place where she kept the truth about Clara Brennan, and the forged deeds and the Cook County warrant, something clenched. "She keeps my house," Arthur said from the doorway. His voice was flat and hard. "That is between her and me. Nothing to do with you. Nothing to do." Pruitt looked at Arthur for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was a small, cold smile, the kind a man gives when he has decided to save his ammunition for later. He turned to the children. Jeb had come inside, drawn by the commotion. Lottie stood in the loft, looking down. Tate had moved to the corner, his hand resting near the skinning knife on the shelf. Pruitt reached into his coat and produced gifts. Peppermint sticks for Jeb, who took them with wide eyes. A blue ribbon for Lottie, who did not come down to receive it, so Pruitt set it on the table with a gentleness that surprised Clementine. And for Lottie he brought one more thing. He drew it from a leather case with the care of a man handling something holy. It was a porcelain doll, about 10 inches tall, with painted blue eyes and a tiny lace dress and real human hair the color of chestnuts. It was old, but perfectly maintained. Not a toy that had been played with, a treasure that had been kept. "This was your mother's," Pruitt said. His voice cracked on the word mother. He held the doll up toward the loft. "She would want you to have it." Lottie's eyes went wide. She did not come down. She did not reach for it, but her fingers gripped the edge of the loft so hard her knuckles turned white. Pruitt set the doll on the table next to the ribbon. He straightened his coat. He looked around the cabin one more time. "I trust you are feeding them properly now," he said to no one in particular. Then he walked out. On the porch he stopped and turned to Arthur. His face was different now. The honey was gone. What was left was granite. "I know what you did," Pruitt said quietly, "and I will not stop until those children are safe from you." He mounted his horse. The sheriff and the two men fell in behind him. They rode down the switchback and disappeared into the trees. Arthur stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded. Then he sat down on the top step and put his head in his hands. Clementine sat beside him. She did not touch him. She did not offer comfort. That was not what this moment needed. "Who is he?" she said. Arthur did not raise his head. "Harlan Pruitt, territorial judge, Mary's father." The silence that followed was long enough for the shadow of the barn to move an inch across the yard. "He believes I killed her," Arthur said. "Did you?" Clementine said. She said it without flinching because she needed to know and because she had learned that the only way to get the truth from a man in pain was to ask for it directly, without cushioning, without mercy. Arthur raised his head. He looked at her. His gray eyes were bloodshot, and there was something in them she had not seen before. Not anger, not guilt. Surrender. "No," he said. "But I might as well have. She asked me for help, Clementine. She told me the water was wrong. She told me someone was coming to the creek at night. She told me she was being poisoned, and I told her she was losing her mind. I told her she was becoming like my mother." He paused. The muscles in his jaw worked. "My mother walked into a river when I was 9 years old. She heard voices. She saw people who were not there. When Mary started talking the same way, I thought, it is happening again. I cannot stop it again. So I stopped listening. I slept in the barn. I locked myself away from her. And she died alone in that bed upstairs." He looked at the locked door, visible through the cabin window. "That room has been shut since the day I found her. I have the key. I have never opened it, because I am afraid of what I will find in there. Not a ghost. Something worse. Proof that she was telling the truth. Proof that I let her die because I was a coward." Clementine sat with this. She let the words settle around her like snow. She did not say it is not your fault because it was his fault, at least part of it. And she did not say I understand because understanding was too easy a word for what she felt. What she said was this: "I know what that feels like, turning your back, and then not being able to turn around again." Arthur looked at her. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not yet. Something more careful. The recognition of a shared wound. Two people who had each, in their own way, failed someone who needed them, and who carried that failure like a stone they could not set down, neither asked for details, neither offered them. And in that silence, in the not asking, was a kind of respect that Clementine had never felt before. A respect for the weight of what is carried. That night, after the children were in the loft, Clementine reread Mary's letter by candlelight. She found a line she had skimmed before, a line that now, after hearing Arthur's story and seeing Pruitt's face, landed with a different weight. "Father is not a bad man," Mary had written. "He just cannot accept that I grew up and chose a life he did not control. But heartbreak can make a good man do ungodly things." Clementine set the letter down. She thought about Pruitt's trembling hands when he held the porcelain doll. She thought about the sheriff's pitying eyes. She thought about the chisel marks at the headwaters of the creek. Someone had poisoned the water. Someone who knew the land. Someone with a reason. Arthur had a reason to be guilty. He was the husband. He was there. He was the obvious suspect. But Pruitt had a reason, too. A father who wanted his daughter back. A judge who was used to controlling outcomes. A man who had refused to open his door when Mary begged to come home. And the sheriff. The man with pity in his eyes and a star on his chest. The man who looked away when Arthur spoke. The way guilty men look away. Clementine did not have answers yet, but she was beginning to see the shape of the questions. Close to midnight, she heard a sound at her door. Not the wind, not the settling of the house. A footstep. Soft. Deliberate. She reached under her pillow and gripped the handle of the paring knife she kept there. Her heart hammered. The door opened. Tate stood in the frame, lit from behind by the last glow of the fire. He was in his nightshirt, barefoot, his dark hair falling over his forehead. He looked young, younger than 12, young enough to still need his mother. He crossed the room without a word and set something on the bedside table. A yellowed envelope sealed with a drop of wax. "Mama told me to keep this," Tate said. His voice was barely a whisper. "She said to give it to whoever was not afraid to stay." He turned and left. His bare feet made no sound on the boards. Clementine picked up the envelope. The wax seal bore no mark. She broke it carefully, the way you handle something that might explode. Inside was a second letter. Same handwriting as the first. Mary's careful, steady hand. But this letter was not addressed to her father. It was addressed to the next woman. Clementine began to read, and as she read, the cabin around her seemed to shrink, the walls drawing in, the shadows deepening, until she felt as if she were sitting not in a room, but in the center of a secret so old and so heavy that the whole mountain had been built on top of it to keep it down. Mary Halloway had known someone would come after her. She had written that woman a map, not of trails, but of everything that had gone wrong. The letter began simply. "If you are reading this, I am dead, and you are braver than I was." Clementine held the paper close to the candle flame, tilting it to catch the words. "The water is wrong," Mary had written. "I stopped drinking from the creek in August. I collected rain in a barrel instead. My sickness eased within a week. The stomach cramps stopped. The trembling in my hands went away. When I told Arthur, he said it was nerves. He said his mother had the same. He would not look at me when he said it." Clementine paused. She thought of Arthur's face when he told her about Ruth Halloway and the river. She thought about what it must have been like for Mary, sick and frightened, to hear her husband compare her to a woman who had walked into freezing water and drowned. She continued reading. "I went to Agatha Clearwater, the Crow midwife who lives by the hot springs below Elk Fork. She is the only one who listened. She tested the water from the creek. She said there was something in it. Not from a bottle, she said. From the rock. From the ground itself. Naturally occurring, but worse than it should be. As if someone had opened the door wider to let more poison through." Cut to morning. Clementine stood at the kitchen stove, cooking flapjacks. The letter was hidden in her bodice, pressed flat against her ribs. She could feel it there like a second heartbeat. Lottie sat at the table, watching Clementine's hands as she mixed the batter. The girl had not spoken again since the word "mama" on that first night and the 3 words, "do not drink water," that had come days later. But she watched. She watched everything. Clementine set a plate in front of her, flapjack and molasses. Lottie picked up the fork, hesitated, then looked at Clementine. Clementine turned away to pour coffee. And as she turned, she caught it, just at the edge of her vision. Lottie's lips moved. The word was silent, just a shape made of breath. Flower. She was practicing. Alone, in the safety of someone not watching, Lottie was teaching herself to speak again. Clementine pretended she had not seen. She set down the coffee pot and said, "Lottie, would you hand me the flour tin from the shelf?" Lottie froze. Her eyes went wide. Then slowly she stood and crossed to the shelf and lifted the tin and brought it back and set it on the table. She did not speak, but her hand, when it touched the tin, was steady. Clementine smiled at her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than Lottie could know. That afternoon, while Jeb napped and Tate was out checking the snare lines he had set in the aspen grove, Clementine returned to the letter. "Agatha gave me a tincture," Mary had written. "An herbal remedy, willow bark and something else, something bitter that made my tongue go numb. I took it for 2 weeks, and I felt like myself again. The fog lifted. The pain stopped. I thought I was cured. Then the tincture started tasting different, sweeter, thicker. I thought Agatha had changed the recipe, so I asked her. She said she had not. She looked frightened, Clementine. Agatha Clearwater does not frighten easy. She said someone must have switched it. She said the new tincture was not medicine. It was nightshade. and something else she could not name. I stopped taking it. But by then the damage was done. Whatever was in that second tincture, it was stronger than the creek water. My body was already weak from months of the arsenic. This new poison finished what the old one started. Clementine set the letter down. Her hands were trembling. "I do not know who is doing this," Mary had written. "I only know they want me gone. Not dead. Gone. There is a difference, and I've spent many nights in this cabin trying to understand it. If I die, Arthur will be suspected. If I leave, Arthur will break. And if Arthur breaks, they take the land. This is about the creek, Clementine. The water. Our homestead sits at the headwaters. Every ranch below us depends on our creek for their livestock and their fields. Whoever controls the headwaters controls the valley. And there is a man in Elk Fork who has wanted this land since before Arthur and I were married. Father is not evil, Mary wrote. And here the handwriting wavered just slightly, as if the pen had been pressed harder into the paper. He is heartbroken that I chose Arthur over him, but heartbreak can make a good man do ungodly things. I think Father wanted me home. I think he thought that if I were sick enough, if Arthur seemed unfit enough, he could petition the territorial court for guardianship over me and the children both. He would get us back, and he would get the land. But something went wrong. The sickness went too far, or the tincture was too strong, or maybe Father did not plan it at all, and it was someone else, someone acting on his behalf, someone who mistook a father's grief for a command. I do not know. I will never know, because by the time you read this, I will be dead, and dead women do not get to ask questions. Clementine read the final passage. If you are the next woman in this house, then you are here for a reason. Maybe God sent you. Maybe chance. Maybe a friend who could not stand to watch Arthur die by inches. Whoever you are, I need you to do what I could not. Find Agatha. She saw the man at the creek. She knows who dug at the rocks. She tried to tell the sheriff and the preacher, and no one listened because she is Crow. And in this territory, a Crow woman's word is worth less than the paper I am writing on. Find her, listen to her, and save my children, because it is not Arthur I am afraid for anymore. It is them. If Father takes them, he will raise them the way he raised me, in a house where love means obedience and the doors only open one direction. And my children were not born for cages. The letter was signed Mary Pruitt Halloway. Below the signature, in smaller letters, she had written one more line. Tell Arthur I forgave him. He will not believe it. Tell him anyway. Clementine folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. She did not cry. She had not cried since Chicago, since the night she ran, since the moment she understood that the life she had built was a lie, and the people she had hurt were real. But she felt the tears behind her eyes like water behind a dam, and she knew that one day the dam would break, and when it did, there would be no stopping it. She looked out the window. Arthur was on the roof, patching a leak he had been ignoring for months. He moved carefully, balancing on the ridge beam with the ease of a man who had spent his life on high and unsteady ground. She watched him work, and he must have felt her gaze because he looked down. Their eyes met through the glass. He held her gaze for 1 second, 2. Then he looked away. No words, no gesture. Just a man on a roof and a woman at a window and the glass between them. That evening, after supper, after the dishes were washed, and Jeb was in his pallet and Lottie was pretending to sleep in the loft, Arthur confronted her. She had been sitting by the fire, reading the letter one more time, committing certain passages to memory. She did not hear him come up behind her. He moved quietly for such a large man. When he spoke, she startled so badly she nearly dropped the paper into the flames. "What is that?" he said. Clementine pressed the letter flat against her chest. Nothing. A letter from home. "You do not have a home," Arthur said. His voice was not cruel. It was factual. "You told me as much the first night. No home, no family, no money to return." So, who is writing you letters? Clementine said nothing. She was calculating the way she had always calculated. What to reveal, what to hold back, how much truth was safe. Arthur reached for the letter. She pulled away. "Give it to me," he said. No. The argument happened fast. It was not loud. Arthur did not shout. He did not raise his hand. But his voice got quieter, which was worse, and his body filled the space between Clementine and the door, which was instinct, not intention, but it made her feel trapped. Then Arthur said the words that would ring in both their ears for days afterward. "Get out. Take the morning wagon and go. I do not need you here. I do not need anyone." He said it in the main room. He said it loud enough that the children heard. Jeb started crying. The sound came from the loft, thin and wailing, the cry of a child who has learned to expect loss and has just heard it confirmed. Lottie retreated to the far wall of the loft and pressed herself against the logs. Tate's face appeared over the edge. He was white as chalk. His eyes were not angry. They were terrified. Because he had heard these words before. He had heard his father say them to his mother. The room went very still. Clementine looked at Arthur. She looked at his clenched hands, and his heaving chest, and his jaw set like stone. She looked at the locked bedroom door behind him. She looked at the loft where 3 children huddled in the aftermath of a bomb he did not know he had detonated. And she said very quietly, "You are doing it again. The exact thing you did to her." Arthur froze. The words went into him like a bullet. She could see the impact. His face drained of color, his hands unclenched, his mouth opened and opened again, and nothing came out. He looked up at the loft, at Tate's white face, at Jeb's crying, at Lottie pressed against the wall. He turned and walked out into the snow. He did not take his coat. He did not take the rifle. He walked into the dark and the cold, and he did not come back for 3 hours. And when he did, Clementine was still sitting by the fire with Mary's letter in her lap, and she looked up at him and neither of them spoke. He sat down across from her. His hands were blue with cold. His beard was crusted with frost. "I am sorry," he said. The words sounded like they had been pried out of him with a crowbar. Clementine nodded. She folded the letter and held it out to him. "This is from Mary," she said. "Your son gave it to me. She wrote it before she died." Arthur looked at the letter. He did not take it. "I cannot read it," he said. "Not yet." "When you are ready," Clementine said. She put it back in her bodice and stood. She paused at the door to her room. "I am not leaving, Arthur. Not because I have nowhere to go, but because those children deserve someone who stays." Arthur stared into the fire. The flames threw shadows across his face that made him look old. "Why?" he said. "Why do you care what happens to us?" Clementine thought about the 37 families, the forged deeds, the faces in the courthouse. She thought about what it meant to take something from people and never be able to give it back. "Because I owe a debt," she said. "Not to you, to the world. And this seems like a good place to start paying it." She went to her room and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the cot and pressed her hands together to stop them shaking. In the morning, Lottie was standing beside her bed. The girl's eyes were dark and solemn. She looked at Clementine for a long time, as if deciding something. Then she spoke, 3 words. The 3rd sentence in 14 months, "Do not drink water." Clementine reached out and took Lottie's hand. It was small and cold, and it gripped hers with a strength that surprised her. "I know," Clementine whispered. "I know about the water. Can you tell me more?" But Lottie shook her head. The secret Mary had made her keep was heavy, and 3 words was all she could carry to the surface at one time. She pulled her hand free and went back to the loft. Clementine sat in the gray morning light and understood. The creek was still poisoned. Whoever had tampered with the rock face, whoever had planted whatever grew near that water, they were still out there. And they were still coming to this mountain. She was running out of time. They all were, the smell of burning hair. That was the first thing Arthur registered when he woke face down in the snow. And the second was Clementine's hand gripping the back of his collar. It happened on the 9th night. Arthur had fallen into a pattern he did not want to examine too closely. He slept by the fire in the main room. Clementine slept in the room off the kitchen. The children slept in the loft. And between midnight and 2 in the morning, Arthur rose and walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking the tree line, the creek path, the back trail. He did this not because he expected to find anything, but because the walking kept the nightmares at bay. On the 9th night, he walked the perimeter and found nothing. He went back inside, banked the fire, and sat down in his chair. He was asleep within minutes. The explosion of light woke him. Not an explosion in truth, but the sudden bloom of orange against the window that turned the cabin from dark to bright in the space of a heartbeat. He was on his feet before his mind caught up. The Winchester was in his hands. He was at the door. The barn was burning. Not the slow creep of a fire that has found a draft and followed it. This was total, all at once, as if the entire interior had been doused in kerosene and set alight. The flames punched through the roof and the heat hit Arthur's face from 40 yards away. The horses. He could hear them screaming. A sound no man forgets. He ran. Behind him he heard Clementine's voice, sharp and commanding, ordering the children to stay inside, to lock the door, to not come out for anything. Then he heard her boots on the porch behind him. The barn doors were open. Not broken open. Open, as if someone had lifted the latch from inside. Arthur plunged through the doorway. The heat was a living thing, pressing against him from all sides. The smoke was black and oily, and it tasted like rendered fat. He found the 2 horses and the mule in their stalls, rearing, kicking, wild with terror. He threw open the stall gates and slapped the mule's hindquarters. It bolted. He grabbed the bridle of the first horse and hauled it toward the door. The second horse would not come. It was a mare named Bess, who had been Mary's horse, the gentlest animal on the property, and she was frozen with fear, her eyes rolled back to the whites, her hooves planted. Arthur grabbed her bridle with both hands and pulled. A burning timber swung down from the loft and caught him across the left forearm. He heard the sizzle before he felt the pain. The sleeve of his shirt caught fire. He slapped it out against his leg and kept pulling. Then Clementine was there. She had a blanket, a wet blanket she had plunged into the water trough outside. She threw it over Bess's head. The mare lunged forward blindly, and Arthur guided her through the doorway and into the yard. Clementine was right behind him. She stepped on a piece of burning wood that had fallen from the roof, and her ankle turned under her. She went down hard, face first into the snow, and cried out. Arthur dropped the bridle and reached for her. She grabbed his good arm, and he hauled her up, but she could not put weight on her right foot. He hoisted her over his shoulder with his burned arm, and the pain nearly whited out his vision. They staggered together away from the barn. 20 yards, 30, until Arthur's knees gave out, and they both went down in the snow near the corral fence. Behind them, the barn collapsed. The roof fell inward with a sound like the world breaking in half. Sparks spiraled into the sky like orange stars. They lay in the snow, breathing. Arthur on his back, cradling his burned arm against his chest. Clementine on her side, clutching her ankle. The heat from the fire reached them even here, warming their faces while the snow froze their backs. "Are you alive?" Arthur said. "I think so," Clementine said. "The horses, they are loose." The mule went toward the creek. "I think the mare is by the fence." Arthur closed his eyes. His arm was screaming. The skin from wrist to elbow felt like it had been peeled off and dipped in salt. He could smell his own burned hair. "It started from inside," he said. "The latch was lifted. Someone came in while we were sleeping." The words hung in the cold air. Someone had entered the property, had walked past the cabin where 5 people slept, had opened the barn doors, had set the fire from within, and had left. The safety they had felt, the illusion that the cabin and the clearing and the mountain were a fortress, was gone. The wall had been breached. Whatever was coming, it was already here. Clementine lay beside him and stared at the burning barn, and felt a fear deeper than any she had known. Not fear for herself, fear for the children inside that cabin, for the man beside her who was hurt and stubborn and broken in ways that might never fully heal, and for the dead woman whose letter was still pressed against her ribs. Then she thought of something else, something immediate. "My satchel," she said. She tried to sit up. The pain in her ankle made her hiss. "Where is my satchel?" It was on the porch. Arthur looked at her. Why? But she was already scanning the yard. The satchel was 20 feet away, half buried in the snow near the corral post. It had been knocked off the porch in the chaos. Its contents were spilled across the white ground. She saw it at the same time she saw Tate. The boy had come outside despite her orders. He stood near the corral, the Winchester in his hands, scanning the tree line the way his father had taught him. But his eyes were not on the trees. They were on the ground, on the papers scattered in the snow. Tate crouched and picked up a newspaper clipping. It was from the Chicago Tribune. It was creased and worn from being folded and refolded and carried for 6 months across half a continent. The headline was visible even from where Clementine lay. "Clerk wanted for forgery in land deed scheme. Clara Brennan, sought by Cook County Sheriff." Tate read it. He looked at Clementine. The firelight played across his face, and she could see the recognition in his eyes. Not shock, not anger. Something colder, something calculating. He folded the clipping and put it in his pocket. He looked at her across the yard, and his expression said, "I know who you are, and now you owe me." Then he turned and went back inside the cabin. Clementine lay in the snow and felt the last of her defenses crumble. Her secret, the one thing she had guarded with everything she had, the lie that had kept her alive and free and one step ahead of the law, was now in the pocket of a 12-year-old boy. Arthur did not see the exchange. His eyes were closed, his breathing ragged. She turned to him. "Let me see your arm," she said. "It is nothing. Arthur, let me see it." He held out his arm. The burn was ugly, red and blistering from wrist to elbow. It needed cleaning and salve and bandaging and probably a doctor, none of which they had. Clementine sat up, ignoring her ankle. She packed snow against the burn, and Arthur hissed and pulled away. "Hold still," she said. And he did, because something in her voice left no room for argument. They sat against the corral fence while the barn burned itself down to coals. The heat died slowly. The cold crept back. Arthur's arm was in a makeshift sling of torn blanket. Clementine's ankle was wrapped in a strip of cloth. She was next to him, their backs against the fence rails, their shoulders almost touching. Neither spoke. The silence was not comfortable. It was the silence of two people who have been through something terrible together and have not yet decided what it means. Arthur reached for her hand. He told himself later it was to check for burns. He took her hand and turned it over, examining her palm in the firelight. It was scraped from the barn door and her nails were broken. He did not let go, and she did not pull away. That was the moment. Not a kiss, not a declaration. Not a scene from a dime novel where the hero sweeps the heroine into his arms. Just two people sitting in the snow while a barn burned, holding hands because they were too tired and too hurt and too scared to pretend they did not need to. By morning, the barn was a smoking ruin. Arthur's arm had stiffened overnight and the pain was constant, a hot pulse that beat in time with his heart. Clementine's ankle had swollen to twice its size and she could not fit her boot over it. And nailed to the fence post, driven into the wood with a 10-penny nail, was a telegram. Arthur pulled it free with his good hand. He read it. His face did not change. He handed it to Clementine. It was addressed to Sheriff Cleet Barrow, Elk Fork, Montana Territory. It read, "Confirm Clara Brennan, alias Clementine Brooks, wanted Cook County for forgery. Hold for transport." Someone had reported her. Someone who knew her real name and her false one. Someone who wanted her gone from this mountain and who had just found the weapon to do it. Clementine looked at the telegram. She looked at Arthur, who was watching her with those gray eyes, and she waited for the question, the accusation, the turning away. Arthur took the telegram from her hand. He folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. "We will deal with that later," he said. "Right now, I need to check the horses." He walked away toward the creek, limping, cradling his arm. Clementine stood alone in the yard with the smell of char in her hair and the cold seeping through her clothes, and 14 days of a life she had built on this mountain crumbling around her. She had days, not weeks, days before the sheriff came for her, days before the truth she had carried from Chicago caught up to her and destroyed everything she had found in this valley. She went inside and made breakfast because that was the only thing she knew how to do when the world was falling apart. Clementine had run from Chicago to Montana. She had nowhere left to run, so she did the only thing remaining. She ran toward the truth. She left the cabin before dawn on a morning so cold the air itself seemed to crack. Arthur was asleep in the main room, his burned arm propped on a pillow, his face slack with exhaustion. The children were in the loft. She left a note on the table. Gone to town, back before dark. It was a lie. She was not going to town. She took the goat path that Tate had described to her 3 days earlier, when she asked him about routes down the mountain that did not pass through the main switchback. Tate had looked at her with those knowing eyes and said, "There is a trail behind the ridge. Hunters use it. It drops down to the hot springs. But if you slip, you fall 500 feet into the gorge, and they will not find you until the snow melts." Clementine took the goat path because the switchback was watched. She knew this the way she knew most things in this valley, by paying attention to what people did not say. Jed had mentioned that Barrow's men patrolled the lower trail. Arthur had mentioned that riders passed through the switchback at odd hours. Someone did not want anyone coming or going from this mountain without being seen. The goat path was everything Tate had promised. It was narrow, barely a foot wide in places, carved into the side of the ridge by elk and mountain goats, and the occasional trapper, who valued solitude over safety. The footing was loose shale covered in a skin of ice. Clementine's ankle screamed with every step. She used a branch as a walking stick, and she went slowly, placing each foot with deliberate care. She fell twice. The first time she caught herself on a juniper root and hung there for a moment, looking down at the gorge below. The drop was sheer. The bottom was a ribbon of frozen creek, surrounded by boulders the color of old bone. She pulled herself up and kept going. The second time she fell harder. Her ankle gave out on a patch of ice, and she went down on her side and slid 5 feet before a rock ledge stopped her. She lay there, gasping, looking up at the sky. It was the palest blue, almost white, and the clouds moved across it like ships across a frozen sea. She thought about not getting up. The snow was soft where she lay. It would be easy to close her eyes and let the cold do its work. Within an hour, she would stop shivering. Within 2, she would stop caring. By nightfall, the snow would cover her, and nobody would know who Clara Brennan was, or what she had done in Chicago, or what she had found in the floorboards of a cabin on a mountain in Montana territory. It would be so easy. Then she thought of Jeb. His face when Arthur shouted, "Get out!" The way his lower lip trembled and his eyes went wide and wet. The face of a child who had heard the beginning of another loss. She got up. She kept walking. The path dropped down through old-growth timber and emerged near the hot springs, where the Absaroka volcanic rock vented steam and sulfur into the cold air. The springs were a series of shallow pools surrounded by mineral-crusted rock, and the steam rose from them in columns that smelled of rotten eggs and warm earth. Beside the springs was a cabin, smaller than Arthur's, better kept. The logs were chinked tight, and the roof was sound, and smoke curled from a stone chimney. A garden plot, dormant now, was fenced against deer. A pen held 3 goats that looked up at Clementine with the blank curiosity of animals that rarely see strangers. She knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, as if the woman inside had been watching her come down the trail. Agatha Clearwater was not what Clementine had expected. She was tall for a woman, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a single braid that hung past her waist. Her face was lined and brown, and her eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, dark and clear and still. She wore a calico dress and a wool shawl, and her hands, when she opened the door, were stained green with the juice of whatever herb she had been grinding. She looked at Clementine. She looked at the walking stick and the swollen ankle, and the face that was red from cold and white from pain. She did not invite her in. "I do not know you," Agatha said. Her English was accented but precise. "My name is Clementine Brooks. I am staying at the Halloway place. I found this." Clementine pulled Mary's letter from inside her coat. Agatha looked at the letter. She looked at Clementine again. Her expression did not change. "Many people have come to my door since Mary died. The sheriff came. He laughed at me. The preacher came. He told me I was superstitious. The judge sent a man to ask me questions. I told him the truth, and he called me a liar." She paused. "Why should I tell you anything? Your people only listen to your own kind." "Because I am not from here," Clementine said. "I do not owe anyone in Elk Fork a thing. I have no friends in this town and no reputation to protect. All I have is a dead woman's letter, and 3 children who need someone to fight for them." Agatha studied her for a long time. Then she stepped aside and held the door open. The cabin was warm and orderly and smelled of dried lavender and something astringent, like vinegar. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling beams. Jars of tincture lined a shelf above the wood stove. A mortar and pestle sat on the table, half full of crushed green leaves. Agatha poured Clementine a cup of tea from a pot on the stove. It was bitter and strong and tasted of willow bark. Clementine set Mary's letter on the table. "Tell me what you know," she said. Agatha sat down. She wrapped her hands around her own cup and looked into it as if she were reading something written on the surface of the tea. Then she began to talk. "In the autumn before Mary died," Agatha said, "I was gathering roots near the headwaters of the creek. I go there in October because the monkshood grows near the hot seeps, and the root is useful in very small amounts for joint pain. In large amounts it is deadly. I was there at dawn. I saw a man at the rock face where the arsenic-bearing water comes through. He had a chisel and a hammer, and he was working at the crack in the stone, widening it, making the opening larger so more of the tainted water would flow into the creek." "Who was it?" Clementine asked. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering. "It was not Arthur," Agatha said. "It was the sheriff, Cleet Barrow." Clementine closed her eyes. Agatha continued. "I watched him for half an hour. He did not see me. When he finished, he covered his work with lichen and dirt and went back down the trail. The next day, I tested the creek water. The arsenic was higher than it had ever been, not enough to kill quickly, but enough to sicken, enough to make a woman seem unstable, confused, easy to dismiss." "Did Pruitt order it?" Clementine asked. Agatha's face tightened. The judge did not want Mary dead. He wanted her home. He wanted her back under his roof where he could control her the way he always had. He told Barrow to make her sick, just sick enough that she could not manage the household, just sick enough that a court would grant him guardianship over her and the children. He thought he was saving her. Agatha paused. Her eyes were hard. "But poison does not obey a man's intentions." The arsenic built up in Mary's body over months. When I gave her the tincture and she improved, someone, Barrow I think, replaced my medicine with something stronger. He was trying to undo my cure. He did not know what he was doing. The dose was wrong. Mary was already weak. Her body could not fight anymore. Agatha reached across the table and took Clementine's hand. Her grip was strong and dry. "He killed his own daughter," Agatha said. "Not with his hands. With his need to own her. And the terrible thing is, he knows it. He has known it since the day she died. That is why he blames Arthur. Because if Arthur is guilty, then Pruitt is innocent. And if Pruitt is innocent, then his daughter's death was someone else's fault, and he can go on living." Clementine stared at the table. The wood grain blurred. She thought of Pruitt's trembling hands holding the porcelain doll. She thought of his voice cracking on the word mother. She thought of Mary's line in the letter. Heartbreak can make a good man do ungodly things. There was one more thing. Agatha stood and went to a shelf. She took down a jar. Inside was creek water, cloudy and tinged with green. She placed it on the table. I collected this from the headwaters 2 years ago, before and after Barrow's work. The difference would be visible to any chemist. She reached into a wooden box and pulled out a pressed flower, purple-blue, with an arching hood shaped like a monk's cowl. "This is monkshood," Agatha said. "Wolfsbane. Its root contains aconite, one of the deadliest poisons known. It does not grow naturally at the headwaters. Someone planted it there near the seep, where its roots would leach into the water and add to the arsenic. It was not an accident. It was a garden of death." Clementine took the jar and the flower and put them in her coat pocket beside Mary's letters. She stood. "I need to go back," she said. "I need to show Arthur." Agatha nodded. She walked Clementine to the door. On the threshold, she stopped. One more thing. The boy, Tate. Mary told him things near the end, things she did not tell anyone else. "He carries more than a child should. Be gentle with what he gives you." Clementine nodded. She stepped into the cold and began the long climb back up the goat path. The afternoon was fading when she reached the ridge above the homestead. The valley below was bathed in a golden light that made the snow glow like amber. She could see the cabin, smoke from the chimney, the shapes of the children through the window. For one breath, one single breath, she stopped and looked at it and thought, maybe I do not need to fight. Maybe I can just stay here and let the truth stay buried and keep making biscuits and telling stories and holding Lottie's hand. Maybe that is enough. Then she walked down the slope and opened the cabin door. The fire was out. The cabin was cold. The children were gone. On the kitchen table, written in Tate's careful hand, was a note. "Granddad came. Pa is in irons. I took the rifle." Clementine read it twice. The words did not change. She picked up Arthur's spare coat, the one that hung on the peg by the door, the one that smelled of wood smoke and horse and him. She put it on. She buttoned it with fingers that would not stop shaking. She put the evidence in the pockets, the jar, the flower, the letters. Then she walked back out into the dark, and she did not stop walking until she reached Elk Fork. Clementine Brooks, or Clara Brennan, or whatever name she would carry to her grave, stood on the ridge above Elk Fork, and understood that within the hour she would save a family, or lose everything. Possibly both. The town was quiet. Lamplight glowed in the windows of the saloon and the general store. A dog barked somewhere. The church steeple was a dark finger pointing at a sky full of stars. She did not go to the church. She did not go to the saloon. She went to the sheriff's office. The door was unlocked. Cleet Barrows sat at his desk with a bottle of whiskey and a tin cup, and the look of a man who had been expecting something terrible and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Clementine walked in and set 3 items on his desk: the jar of creek water, the pressed monkshood flower, Mary Halloway's 2 letters. Barrow looked at them. He did not touch them. Clementine spoke. Her voice was calm. She had rehearsed this on the trail down the mountain, turning the words over like stones in her hand until they were smooth and hard. "You dug at the headwaters," she said. "You widened the arsenic seep. You planted wolfsbane near the creek. When Agatha Clearwater's tincture started curing Mary, you replaced it with something stronger. You did all of this because Judge Pruitt told you to, and you are wearing the same boots that left prints on Arthur Halloway's back porch 3 nights ago." Barrow looked down at his boots. They were old and cracked, with a split in the left heel that Clementine had noted in the boot prints on the porch. He did not deny it. "The judge said she would not die," Barrow said. His voice was hollow. "He said we just needed her sick enough to bring her home. He wanted his girl back. He wanted the grandchildren. He said Arthur was not fit. He said the court would agree. I never." He stopped. His face crumpled. He was not a villain. He was a man who had followed orders from someone he loved and feared, the way he had followed orders in the war, the way men like him had always followed orders, and the orders had killed someone. Clementine felt no sympathy. Sympathy was a luxury she could not afford tonight. "You can tell that to me," she said. "Or you can tell it to the deputy marshal when he rides over from Helena. But before you do either, you will release Arthur Halloway, now." Barrow opened a drawer. He took out a ring of keys. He stood and walked to the back of the office where a heavy door led to the two-cell county jail. Arthur was in the first cell. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the stone wall. His burned arm was wrapped in a dirty bandage. There was a bruise on his cheekbone and a cut above his eye. Barrow's men had not been gentle. When the cell door opened, Arthur stood. He looked at Barrow. He looked at Clementine, standing behind the sheriff in Arthur's own coat with her hair wild and her face red from the cold and the evidence of his wife's murder in her pockets. "Where are my children?" Arthur said. That was his first question. Not what happened. Not how did you get here. Not what is going on. Where are my children? Pruitt took them to his house, Barrow said. He would not meet Arthur's eyes. Arthur walked out of the cell. He walked past Barrow without touching him, which required more restraint than Clementine had thought him capable of. He walked out of the sheriff's office and into the street. Clementine followed him. They walked side by side through the empty street toward Pruitt's house, which sat at the end of the main road, a white clapboard two-story with a picket fence and a porch light burning. Clementine reached for Arthur's arm. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "Let me go first," she said. "If you go in there angry, he will use it against you. He will say you're dangerous. He will say the children are not safe with you. You know this." Arthur's jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping. She went up the porch steps and knocked on Pruitt's door. It opened almost immediately. Pruitt stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his silver hair disheveled, his face the color of old wax. He looked at Clementine. He did not seem surprised. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Or should I say, Miss Brennan?" He stepped aside. She entered. The parlor was warm and well-furnished. Bookshelves lined the walls. A fire burned in the grate. Above the mantel was a portrait of a young woman with chestnut hair and a shy smile. Mary. Clementine looked at the portrait and then at Pruitt. And she saw the resemblance not in the features but in the eyes. The same watchful, careful eyes. The eyes of people who have learned to keep things inside. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She sat down in the chair across from Pruitt and folded her hands in her lap and asked a single question. "Did you love her?" Pruitt's chin trembled. "More than my own life," he said. "Then love her children the right way," Clementine said. "Let them go home." "He does not deserve them," Pruitt said. "No one ever deserves children," Clementine said. "But you know what they deserve. They deserve their father. They deserve their home. And they deserve the truth about what happened to their mother." Pruitt's eyes went to the mantel, to Mary's portrait. His face was the face of a man watching the last brick of his carefully constructed wall come loose. Then his expression hardened. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded telegram. "You think you can stand in my house and lecture me," he said. "You are a criminal, Clara Brennan. Wanted for forgery in Cook County. I have the wire right here. I send one message to Helena and you spend the next 5 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge." The words landed like stones. Clementine felt each one. Then she heard the front door open behind her. Arthur stood in the parlor doorway. He had heard everything. The silence that followed was the longest of Clementine's life. Arthur looked at her. His gray eyes were steady. She could see him processing. Clara Brennan. Forgery. Wanted. She could see the question forming. She could see the choice. She stood and faced him. She did not lie. "My name is Clara Brennan," she said. "I was charged with forging land deeds in Chicago. I was not framed. I knew the deeds were false, and I signed them anyway because I needed the money. 37 families lost their land because of what I did. Everything I told you about why I came here was a lie." She paused. Her voice did not break, though it wanted to. "But everything I have done since I walked through your cabin door has been the truth." Arthur looked at her for a long time. She could see his mind working behind those gray eyes. She could see him thinking about Mary, about all the times Mary had told him the truth and he had turned away, about what it cost him, about what it cost everyone. This time he did not turn away. He looked at Pruitt. "Send your wire," he said. "Have her arrested if that is what you need. But first you give me back my children." Pruitt looked at Arthur. He looked at Clementine. He looked at the portrait of Mary above the mantel. And something broke in him. Not loudly, not dramatically. It broke the way old wood breaks. A slow, splintering fibers giving way one by one until the whole structure shifts and settles into a new shape. He walked to the foot of the stairs. "Tate," he called. His voice was hoarse. "Bring your brother and sister down." Tate appeared at the top of the stairs. He was holding the Winchester. His face was pale and set. Behind him, Lottie held Jeb's hand. Jeb's cheeks were streaked with dried tears. They came down the stairs. Jeb saw Clementine and broke free of Lottie's hand and ran across the parlor and threw his arms around her legs and buried his face in her coat. "Mama Clem," he said. And the dam Clementine had been holding since Chicago finally cracked and the tears came and she knelt and held him and did not try to stop them. Pruitt sank into his chair. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had held power for 40 years and had just let it go. "Take them home," he said. His voice was barely audible. Arthur reached down and picked up Jeb. He settled the boy on his good hip. He looked at Tate, who was watching from the bottom of the stairs. "Let us go, son," Arthur said. Tate walked to the door. He paused beside Clementine. He did not look at her. He said quietly, "Clara is a good name." Clementine laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and bright, the first sound of genuine joy she had made in Montana. It startled her. It startled everyone. They walked out into the street, Arthur, Clementine, and 3 children. The snow was melting. The eaves dripped. Somewhere on the ridge above town, an owl called. Behind them, through the parlor window, Pruitt sat alone. On the desk before him was the porcelain doll. Lottie had left it on the stairs. He picked it up and held it against his chest and closed his eyes. The portrait of Mary watched over him from the mantel. The shy smile. The careful eyes. The room was very quiet. The new barn did not go up in a single day the way it happens in storybooks. It took 3 weeks, and Arthur cursed every time he missed a nail. Spring came to the Elk Fork Valley the way it always did, in fits and starts, with sudden warm days that melted the snow into rushing streams and cold nights that froze everything solid again. The aspens budded, and the meadow grass turned green in patches, and the elk moved back up to the high country, and the world remembered that it knew how to be alive. Clementine stood on the porch one April morning and watched Arthur wrestle a roof beam into place on the new barn frame. Tate was below, handing up nails. They did not talk much while they worked, but the silence between them had changed. It was not the cold silence of a father and son who could not reach each other. It was the warm silence of 2 people doing something hard together and not needing words to do it. Jed helped by carrying a single nail at a time from the keg to the barn, a distance of about 40 feet. He made this trip approximately 900 times. He was very serious about it. Lottie sat on the corral fence and sang. Her voice was thin and sweet, and she sang the hymns her mother had taught her, the words floating across the yard like something you could almost see. The first time Lottie sang, 3 weeks after they came back from Pruitt's house, Arthur had been at the kitchen table. He froze. His face went white. He stood up and walked outside and stood in the yard with his back to the cabin and his hands at his sides and did not move for 10 minutes. When he came back in, his eyes were red. He did not explain. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and that was that. But from that day forward, when Lottie sang, Arthur would pause whatever he was doing and listen, just for a moment, and then he would go back to work. The legal thread unspooled slowly. Jed helped Clementine draft a letter to a lawyer in Chicago, a man Jed knew from his Army days who had gone into practice. Arthur sold a portion of his water rights to the town, not all, but an easement that allowed the ranches below to draw from the creek at a set rate. It was a compromise. It was the right thing to do. The money went to Clementine's legal defense. In June, word came from Chicago that Edmund Voss had been arrested in St. Louis for running the same scheme on a new set of victims. He was convicted in federal court and sentenced to 12 years. With Voss in prison, the Cook County District Attorney reviewed Clementine's case. The charges were reduced, then dropped. She was free. But free did not feel the way she thought it would. There were nights that summer when Clementine packed her satchel and sat by the cabin door and listened to the darkness and thought about leaving. Not because she wanted to, but because the habit of running was so deep in her that stillness felt like a kind of danger. Every creak of the cabin, every hoot of an owl, every shuffle of the horses in the new barn sounded like footsteps coming for her. She unpacked the satchel every morning, and every morning the unpacking got a little easier. Cleet Barrow was arrested in March and transported to the territorial prison at Deer Lodge to await trial. He confessed to everything. He named Pruitt as the man who gave the orders, but the territorial prosecutor looked at the evidence: a Crow woman's testimony, a dead woman's letters, a jar of creek water, and said it was not enough to convict a sitting judge. Not in Montana Territory in 1883, not when the witness was native and the accused was white. It was unjust. Clementine knew it. Arthur knew it. Agatha, who had known it for 2 years, simply nodded when Clementine brought her the news. "I did not expect justice," Agatha said. "I expected truth. Truth is harder to bury. It grows back like monkshood." Pruitt resigned from the bench. He was not prosecuted. He moved to a smaller house at the edge of town, and he aged 10 years in 6 months. The town that had once deferred to him now looked at him with the careful, measured distance people reserve for those who have fallen from grace. In June, he appeared at the cabin. He came alone, on foot, having walked the switchback trail. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and he looked at the cabin and the new barn and the children playing in the corral, and he did not come any closer. Arthur saw him from the barn. He set down his hammer. He walked across the yard and stood 10 feet from Pruitt, and the two men looked at each other. They did not speak for a long time. Then Pruitt said, "I would like to see my grandchildren, if you will allow it." Arthur looked at Clementine, who was standing on the porch. She nodded, just barely. A dip of her chin that carried the weight of everything she knew about fathers and daughters and the terrible things love can do. "Sunday," Arthur said. "You come for Sunday dinner?" Pruitt's jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek jumped. One tear fell from his left eye, tracked down the deep lines of his face, and disappeared into his collar. He wiped it with the back of his hand and nodded once. "Thank you," he said. He put his hat on and walked back down the trail. Arthur watched him go. Then he went back to the barn and picked up his hammer and drove a nail so hard the head sank flush with one stroke. The children healed the way children do, not all at once, but in small, bright moments that stacked up over time like stones in a cairn. Tate started calling Clementine Miss Clara. The first time he did it, she looked at him and he shrugged as if it meant nothing, but they both knew it did. It was the first time anyone in Montana had used her real name and made it sound like something worth keeping. He taught her to ride. She was terrible at it. She gripped the reins too tight and sat too far forward, and the mare sensed her fear and tested her constantly. Tate sat on the corral fence and critiqued her form with the ruthless honesty of a 12-year-old boy. "You ride like a sack of flour with opinions," he said. "And you smell like a goat," Clementine shot back, and Tate laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It sounded like Arthur's laugh, like something that had been locked in a chest and was finally let out. One afternoon in July, Tate found Clementine on the porch. He sat down beside her and held out the Tribune clipping, the one he had taken from the snow the night of the fire. I figure you do not need me holding this over you anymore, he said. Clementine took it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she tore it in half and then in half again and let the pieces fall into the wind. Thank you, Tate, she said. He stood up to go, then he stopped. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. The last one. The letter Mary had given him, the one addressed to the next woman. He held it out. Not to Clementine. To Arthur, who had come up the porch steps behind them. Mama wrote this, Tate said. His voice was steady, but his chin trembled. She wrote it for whoever came next. But I think she wrote it for you too, Pa. She wanted you to know what happened. She wanted you to believe her. Arthur took the letter. He held it the way a man holds a live coal, carefully, knowing it will burn but unwilling to let go. He sat down on the porch step. He read the letter slowly. The afternoon light fell across his shoulders, and the breeze carried the smell of new hay and pine sap and wildflowers. Somewhere in the corral, Jeb was laughing at something Lottie had said. Arthur finished reading. He folded the letter with great care, pressing the creases flat with his thumb. He pressed it against his chest. Then his shoulders broke. The wall he had built, the wall of silence and self-punishment and frozen grief that had kept him upright for 2 years, came down. It came down quietly, the way an old tree falls in the forest. And Arthur Halloway wept. Tate sat down beside his father. He did not say a word. He placed his hand on Arthur's shoulder. It was a man's gesture performed by a boy's body, and it was the bravest thing Tate had ever done. They sat like that for a long time, father and son, side by side on the porch step, with the mountain above them, and the valley below, and the silence between them finally empty of everything except love. One evening in late July, after the children were in bed and the fire was low, Jed came to supper. He had been visiting regularly since the spring, bringing news from town and supplies and the particular kind of awkward cheerfulness that guilty men adopt when they are trying to make amends. But this night was different. After the meal, after the coffee was poured and the dishes were cleared, Jed sat in the chair by the fire and could not stop fidgeting. He crossed and uncrossed his legs. He turned his cup in his hands. He opened his mouth 3 times and closed it. Finally, Arthur said, "Spit it out, Jed, before you wear a hole in my chair." Jed set his cup down. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Clementine. He took a deep breath. "I did not place that advertisement just because I was worried about you, Arthur," he said. The fire crackled. A log shifted. The room was very still. "Agatha told me the truth about Barrow and the creek 2 years ago," Jed continued. "Right after Mary died. She came to my shop and she told me everything. The chisel marks, the wolf's bane, Barrow's boots at the headwaters, all of it." He paused. His eyes were bright with shame. "I was too much of a coward to do anything about it. I was afraid of Pruitt. I was afraid of Barrow. I was afraid of what would happen to me if I stood up and said something. So I did nothing. For 2 years I did nothing. I let you sit up here on this mountain and grieve and rot, and I knew the truth, and I kept my mouth shut." Arthur's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "Then I thought," Jed said, "what if I brought someone in from outside? Someone who did not owe anyone in Elk Fork. Someone who was smart enough and desperate enough to dig into this. Someone who would do what I could not." He looked at Clementine. His eyes were wet. "I chose you from 30 letters," he said, "because you were the only one who wrote. I am willing to do whatever it takes." I needed someone willing. I used you, Clementine. I put you on that train and sent you into a house full of secrets and danger, and I did it because I was too afraid to face it myself. And I am sorry. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Arthur stood up. For a moment, Clementine thought he was going to hit Jed. His fists were clenched and the cords in his neck stood out like ropes. But he did not hit him. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark and the stars and the ridge of the Absaroka black against the sky. He stood there with his back to the room and breathed. Clementine looked at Jed for a long time. She thought about the night at the train station when Jed was fidgety and would not look at her. She thought about the way he had steered her toward the goat path, the way he had always seemed to know just a little more than he was saying. All of it made sense now, all of it rearranged in her mind like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. She should have been furious. She had every right to be furious. "You are right," she said. "You did use me, and I should be angry." Jed flinched. "But I would have done the same thing," Clementine said. "I have done the same thing. I looked the other way. I let someone else take the fall. That is why I was in Chicago. That is why I ran." "We are the same kind of coward, Jed. The only difference is your cowardice saved a family." Jed stared at her. Then he put his face in his hands. Arthur turned from the window. He looked at Jed, then at Clementine, then at Jed again. "Get out of my house," Arthur said, but not unkindly. More like a man saying something that needed to be said so that the next thing could happen. Jed stood. He put on his hat. At the door, he stopped. "I am sorry," he said again. He meant it. He left. Arthur sat back down. The fire was dying. The room was cooling. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with the sound of something breathing. "You forgave him fast," Arthur said. Clementine looked at the fire. "I was not forgiving him," she said. "I was forgiving myself." Arthur was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Clara." She looked at him. It was the first time he had used her real name. "I read Mary's letter," he said. "She said to tell me she forgave me. She said I would not believe it." He paused. "She was right. I do not believe it. But I am going to try." He looked at her. In the firelight, his gray eyes were warm for the first time since she had known him. Not hot, not cold. Warm. The warmth of a banked fire that has been tended with care. "I'm going to try a lot of things," he said. Clementine smiled. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His scarred hand. The one that had been burned saving Mary's horse. The one that had pulled her out of a tree. The one that had held hers in the snow while the barn burned. "That is enough for now," she said. A week later, on a Sunday afternoon in August, Arthur and Clementine were mending the fence line at the north end of the property. The sun was high and hot, and the meadow grass was waist-high and full of butterflies, and the creek ran clear and loud. Arthur drove a post into the ground with a maul. He did not look at her. "The rail line is running again," he said. "I know," Clementine said. She was stringing wire, and her hands were busy. "You could go back," Arthur said. "Your name is cleared. Is that what you want?" Arthur stopped hammering. He set the maul on the post and looked at her. She was brown from the sun, and her hands were rough, and there was a streak of dirt on her cheek. And she looked nothing like the pale, frightened woman who had stepped off the train 8 months ago. "I want you to stay," he said. "But I want you to stay because you choose it, not because you have got nowhere else." Clementine set down the wire. She walked over to him and took the maul from his hand and set it on the ground. She took his scarred hand in hers and held it against her chest, where he could feel her heartbeat. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you. I choose those impossible children." Arthur pulled her close. He kissed her in the daylight, standing beside an unfinished fence, smelling of sweat and hay and pine tar. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been holding his breath for 2 years and had finally let it go. And Clementine kissed him back with everything she had, every lie and every truth, and every mile she had traveled to get to this place. When they pulled apart, Arthur reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a ring. It was silver, simple, with a smooth band that caught the sunlight. "I had the smith in town melt Mary's ring," Arthur said, "and recast it. It is not her ring anymore. It is not a new ring either. It is a ring that got broken and made again." He looked at her. "Like us," he said. Clementine held out her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. From the corral, 3 faces watched through the fence rails. "I told you," Lottie whispered. "Gross," Tate said. But he was smiling. Come on, Jeb said, tugging Tate's sleeve. Let us go finish the pie. They disappeared around the side of the barn, arguing about who got the bigger slice. Arthur and Clementine stood in the meadow with the ring between them and the mountain above them, and the valley wide and green and alive below. She leaned her head against his chest. His arms went around her. I never liked Chicago, she said. He laughed, a real laugh, deep and full and free, the kind of laugh that shakes the dust off everything it touches. That evening, while the family sat at supper, Agatha Clearwater walked the ridge trail above the Halloway homestead. She moved slowly, the way old women move through familiar ground, with the certainty of someone who knows every root and stone. She paused at the edge of the clearing. Below her, the cabin glowed with lamplight. She could hear faintly the sound of Lottie singing. She could see the new barn, solid and straight, its fresh timber pale against the dark of the mountain. She walked on down a short path through the lodgepole pines to a small mound of earth beneath a solitary tree. The mound had changed since she was last here. There was a headstone now, carved in granite. The letters were rough, cut by hand, by a boy who was learning to carve and a father who was learning to remember. The stone read, Mary Pruitt Halloway, beloved, believed too late. Agatha knelt beside the grave. She reached into the pouch at her belt and drew out a single flower, a prairie aster, blue as the Montana sky, small and alive and trembling in the evening breeze. She laid it on the stone. She stayed, Mary, Agatha whispered, like you said someone would. Rest now. She stood. She looked down at the homestead one more time. The lamplight, the smoke, the sound of a family having supper together, which is the oldest and most ordinary miracle in the world. Then she turned and walked back through the sagebrush, and the Absaroka wind carried the petals from the flower across the meadow, past the new barn where Arthur's tools hung in neat rows on the wall, past the corral where Tate's saddle sat on the top rail drying in the last light, past the kitchen window where Lottie was singing a hymn she had learned from her mother, and up to the back porch where Clementine stood with her hand on the railing Arthur had planned smooth the week before. The wood still smelled of new sap. She pressed her palm against it and felt the grain smooth and warm from the day's sun. She had come to Montana to disappear. She had come with a false name and a real guilt, and nowhere in the world to stand. But this valley, this stubborn, brutal, beautiful valley, had not let her vanish. It had made her real. The stars were coming out over the Absaroka. The creek sang in the dark. And on the railing beside Clementine's hand sat a small carved bird, a swallow, whittled from pine by a 12-year-old boy who had once said that everyone leaves. She picked it up, she held it in her palm, she looked at the stars, and for the first time in her life, Clementine did not want to be anywhere else in the world. Now, if this story taught us anything, it is this. The family you are born into is a matter of luck, but the family you choose, the one you fight for and bleed for and stand up for, even when it costs you everything, that family is a matter of courage. Clementine did not find love on that mountain by accident. She found it by deciding to stop running. And Arthur did not find redemption by being forgiven. He found it by finally choosing to believe. So let me ask you this. If you were standing on that frozen platform in Elk Fork with $14 in your pocket and a secret that could destroy you, would you have gotten in that wagon or would you have turned back? Think about it. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something you were not expecting, I would love to hear about it. Leave your thoughts below. And make sure you are following along so you do not miss the next story. There are more tales from the frontier coming, and I promise you they are worth the ride. Until next time. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters.